From the Chilean Apple to the Apple iPad, we recognize that globalization is all around us. But we can hardly agree on a definition of the buzzword, let alone on how interconnectedness affects issues such as inequality and development. To get a better sense of globalization's effects on the United States, I sat down with Dr. Jason Furman, chairman of the White House Council of Economic Advisors.
Globalization has created enormous opportunities for the American economy. It's created jobs in exporting industries that pay higher than average. It's given consumers access to a wide range of goods at better prices. But globalization has also created a lot of challenges for the economy and has almost certainly contributed to the increase in inequality we've seen in the last couple decades.
Research suggests a marked increase in inequality in the United States in recent decades. Is this in some ways an effect of globalization?
Different research has come up with different percentages of how much inequality is due to which factor. Globalization shows up in two types of ways in terms of inequality. One is it just changes the relative reward to different factors. That's the traditional theory of international trade. So if you have more plentiful, lower income, less skilled labor competing, that can drive wages down. But another factor about globalization, which is less a part of traditional trade theory, but increasingly understood as part of the story for the top 1%, is if you have a hedge fund manager or an investment banker operating instead of on the scale of a region, at the scale of a country or the scale of the world, the returns that they can command in a global competition for talent can be that much larger. So globalization has also increased the reward to a certain number of superstars or just maybe super lucky people at the very top.
So you talked about the differences in terms of labor wages and also in terms of return to capital investment. Are there particular policy approaches that the United States can take to perhaps mitigate potential inequality effects of globalization?
I think that's a really important point, is that there's a difference between the phenomenon of globalization, and that's happening because of communications, because of transportation, because of a whole range of things, and then particular policies towards globalization. So to give you an example, the President is currently negotiating an ambitious trade agreement with our partners in the Pacific and another one with our partners in Europe. In terms of the Pacific, one of the important things in that agreement is to make sure that you're taking labor standards and raising them. That could be an example of a policy that will increase globalization, but will also do it by more of a race to the top than a race to the bottom with better labor and environmental standards. So it would actually help you channel globalization and move it in the right direction.
Now you mentioned the Trans-Pacific Partnership and Transatlantic Trade Investment Pact, if not in name, in reference. I think that perhaps part of the reason we've gone in that direction is because of stalled World Trade Organization negotiations. Do you think these bilateral and multilateral trade pacts are a second best solution, or are they a reasonable way to restart perhaps a stalled dialogue in terms of facilitating global trade?
I think if you're talking about these two trade agreements, TPP and TTIP, that is nearly 3/4 of the global economy. So you are getting an enormous amount in there. So, and they're very ambitious in terms of the scope of them. They're not just about traditional tariff issues. They go well beyond that. So we're trying to proceed at the WTO. We're trying to proceed in these plurilateral settings. We've done bilateral trade agreements in the recent past in the United States too. So we're trying to proceed on multiple levels. But in all of these, we're trying to do the same thing, which is make sure that we're raising the standards when it comes to labor and environment. So rather than just globalization happening on its own, you're taking it and imposing a set of rules that make it more likely that it'll work for workers in the United States and around the world.
So you would say that if TPP and TTIP are done correctly, that this could actually push the dialogue of global trade in the right direction for the future, that this could set a standard that the rest of the globe would be more inclined to follow moving forward?
Absolutely. That's what we're trying to do, is have a new, ambitious, high-quality trade agreement.
Now, I think it's not uncommon to hear talk of winners and losers from globalization. From your perspective, is globalization a zero-sum game in which you have winners that come at the expense of losers, or is that a misunderstanding of the concept?
I think globalization is a classic positive sum activity in which, by taking advantage of your comparative advantage, you can get better jobs for your workers and better products for your consumers. But there is no doubt that it brings a set of challenges, and partly you want to manage those with the way in which you do globalization in terms of agreements, but also what you're doing domestically. Part of what we're trying to do in the United States is make the United States a more attractive destination for companies to set up, do business. Part of that is making it a better place to export from, which trade agreements help. Part of that is reforming our business tax system, improving our infrastructure, investing more in education. All of those are steps that are complementary to globalization and more likely to make it work. For those that also lose out, there's trade adjustment assistance that expires in the United States at the end of this year, and making sure that you're extending that so you have something robust to help people get back on their feet, get retrained for another job, is important too. But the first step is making sure there's the jobs.
Now, I wonder, is there an inherent difficulty here where you would like to attract more businesses to be housed in the United States, but at the same time, does that raise difficulty in maintaining labor standards if you want to compete with other parts of the world that perhaps don't demand the same labor standards as we might hope for in the United States?
The biggest strength of the United States is its productivity and its skilled workforce. We also have great infrastructure, plentiful access to energy, and access to the world's export markets. We could improve in all of those dimensions. There's a lot more we need to do on our infrastructure, there's a lot more we need to do on education, but still, compared to other countries, we're in very good shape in a lot of those dimensions, and that allows you to pay higher wages in the United States.
Now, one thing that we're trying to do at the Bertelsmann Foundation is to measure the effect of globalization on inequality. And I wonder, from your perspective, if it makes more sense to view that in terms of comparing countries, such as developed versus developing, or does it make more sense to compare how globalization affects inequality across, say, the middle class, or for global labor?
I think analytically there's a lot of ways. I think you get insights from looking at the impact on individual countries. I think you get insights from looking at inequality between countries on average. I think you get some insights from looking at inequality in terms of, at the global level and people all over the world. And all of those have different causes, different consequences, and are important in different ways. Certainly one thing that we'd like to see out of globalization is more nations growing more quickly. Convergence is a standard economic phenomenon. If you are behind, you can take advantage of technology, capital, and other things to grow more quickly and catch up. That's a good thing for the United States. That's a good thing for the world, and we'd like to make sure that that's happening and making sure that our economy also benefits from it.
And in fact, you've stated in the past that it's your belief that reducing inequality can in fact increase growth. And it seems to be that you're arguing that this holds globally as well, that the reduction of inequality in emerging markets could in fact facilitate growth in more developed economies such as the United States. Would you agree with this?
I'd say there's a traditional view that inequality is good for growth, and people had that decades ago, and if you're doing anything about inequality, you'd hurt growth. We now know that there are a large number of things on the other side of the ledger, ways in which inequality is bad for growth, and reducing it can actually help growth. You get more educated people contributing to your economy, people who are willing to take more risks of the type you need for entrepreneurs if they know they won't have too far to fall if they fail. The type of trust you need for market institutions to function goes down when inequality goes up, and political instability goes up when inequality goes up, and that's also bad for growth. So we now know a lot of different reasons why inequality can be bad for growth. I think the empirical evidence isn't completely definitive, but I think the evidence is stronger for the proposition that reducing inequality helps growth than it is for the opposite. Certainly more research is needed. The types of policies matter. If you randomly and crudely deal with inequality, you could hurt your growth. If you expand access to preschool for the poor, you're almost certainly going to help your growth. And then there's probably a lot of things in between those two.
So moving forward, how can we look at globalization and interconnectedness in general in order to try to spread opportunity and decrease inequality around the world?
I think that's a big question and it's a long answer. But if we have the best economic policies that we could have for a closed economy, become even more important in an open economy. Even if there was no trade, we'd care about infrastructure, we'd care about education, we'd care about how the middle class was doing. We care about those even more in a world where there is international trade. And what that tells you is you have huge markets that you can take advantage of and benefit from if you do the smart and the right things. We also want to make sure, though, that everyone has some basic level. Now, we've made big strides in terms of health insurance, of making sure you have that regardless of what situation you're in. Raising the minimum wage would make sure you have at least a minimum threshold of labor earnings. Expanding access to retirement is another step that, retirement savings is another step that we should be taking. So, there's sort of no shortage of things. The globalization list isn't vastly different from the non-globalization list. It's only more important.
Dr. Furman, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.